Okay, so hello everybody. I'm very pleased to welcome Brendan Larvor, who's very gratefully, very generously agreed to talk to us today about his work on Lakatos. So Brendan is he's a philosopher from the University of Hertfordshire. He's a philosopher of mathematics. He's a big cheese in the philosophy of mathematical practice community, and he wrote a very good, in my view, very good textbook on Lakatos, which you've been reading this week. So welcome, Brendan.
Thank you.
Maybe we could start by, so you're a philosopher of mathematics, but of course we're discussing Lakatos in the context of his work on the philosophy of science today. Maybe we could start by sort of you telling us how you got interested in Lakatos and his work on the philosophy of science.
Well, really from the mathematics side, right? So somebody sent me a list of interesting books in philosophy of maths. There you are. Proofs and Refutations was one of them. And I thought, oh, this is terrific. So I read it, and then I thought, well, what do you do next? And I didn't know the answer to that. I realized the reason I didn't know the answer to that was because I didn't really understand the logic of his argument. Because it wasn't like any kind of philosophical argument I'd ever encountered before. So it was a doctorate-sized task to work out what the logic of his argument in that little book was. And that involved looking at everything he wrote, including the philosophy of science. So I had to get the hang of his philosophy of science, just as that kind of intellectual biography project. I also had to learn quite a lot about his early life. So I had to learn more than most philosophers of maths do about Hungarian Marxism and Lukács and Hegel and stuff like that, which were part of his intellectual life, and I don't think were ever really expunged from his mental habits. I don't think you get so thoroughly trained in Central European philosophical tradition and then just sort of throw it all off just because you've arrived at the LSE. I don't think it works like that.
Lovely. Okay, so that's interesting. So you came at the stuff we're discussing today really out of a sort of broadening of your general interest in Lakatos.
Yeah.
So I've got some questions about Lakatos's way of thinking about scientific disciplines, which I'm hoping you'll be able to help us with. So one question that people often ask when we discuss this is the issue of the scale to which you should apply the notions of a research program. So you can think of, perhaps you could think about psychology as being a research program, or perhaps you could think about cognitive psychology, or perhaps you could think about mathematical cognition, or so there seems to be options of which scale you apply these as theoretical tools. Do you think there's a right way of doing that?
Well, I'm fairly sure that names of disciplines and sub-disciplines is the wrong way. Because if you look at his examples of research programs, they're mostly from physics, and they're not the names of discipline areas. So he talks quite a lot about Niels Bohr, and basically it's the program expressed in a single paper. So I guess if you're looking at if you're an originalist, that's to say, if you think that the way to think about things is to reconstruct the views of the original authors of the antique documents that you're trying to understand, then it's going to be something like a program is going to be something like the contents of a paper that's important enough to become canonical, that changes the direction of a lot of people's work. So Bohr writes a paper that earns a place in the history of physics because a whole raft of people start change direction as well. So Lakatos's examples tend to be that kind of scale. So not a whole book, but a paper that really is a corner on which the history of the discipline turns. But having said all that, I don't think there's anything in the logic of his position that requires that.
Yeah.
So if you were trying to take these ideas and take them somewhere else and do something else with them, I don't think there's any deep problem if you identified a research program that was either quite a bit smaller or quite a bit bigger than that.
Okay, that's very helpful. Yeah, thank you. Here's a question for you then. So one thing that I've always wondered about this is it definitely the case that if we're working in the same, suppose you and I are working in the same research program, how do I know that you have the same idea as me about whether a particular assumption is within the hardcore or the protective belt? I mean, if we never talk about it, maybe we'll never find out that you actually have quite a different view than me. And if that's the case, in what sense can we be said to actually be working in the same program?
Good. Well, if we bring the same techniques to the same problems, and when we encounter counter evidence, we don't fall out with each other about what to do about it. So I suspect that, and this is where the shadow of Hegel starts to fall across the discussion, that it may only be retrospectively that you can say, yes, because I mean it may only be. So Hegel thinks that it's only after something's collapsed that you can really say what it means, because you only by that point you know what it's turned into, what its legacy is. And there may be something of that in this, that if a research program runs for a bit and then runs into trouble and people abandon it for something else, it may only be at that point that you can say, aha, we now know what the hardcore was, because that was the thing they were all, that was the Alamo they were trying to defend at the very end, the last redoubt.
Yeah. So in some sense, it's quite I mean, you comment in the chapter we've read that this is a very historically oriented way of thinking about the philosophy of science. So in some sense, that fits with that view that perhaps this is really a tool for looking backwards. So that's another question that often crops up when we read this chapter. So is Lakatos, in your view, saying that this is how science has been done historically, or is he saying that this is both how it's been done historically and how it should be done? If I just behave completely inconsistently with what he's saying, am I a bad scientist, or am I just doing something new and different?
Well, he's got to say that this is how most of science has gone historically, because his claim, or like this, how most of successful science has gone historically, right? So his claim is, you should prefer my model to Popper's model and Kuhn's model and whoever else, because my model makes people who we know to be great and successful scientists look like rational players. Yeah. So my model fits the historical data better. So he's got to claim that the really impressive bits of the history of science went that match his model. I'm carefully not saying they conform to his model. It's not that Newton had some shadowy version of the methodology of scientific research programs in mind.
Yeah.
Somehow, none of that. But more of the history of science looks rational according to Lakatos's model. And he also says that at the very least, you should use his model to keep score. All right. So this was his big argument with Feyerabend. So at one point, Lakatos says something like, I can tell you using my model what's progressing and what's degenerating. And if a research program is degenerating, it should have its money cut. And the people who work on it should be encouraged to do something else. Feyerabend says, but you can only keep score up to the present moment. You don't know that in future, any research program might recover its forces, rejuvenate, start to become progressive again. And if you've cut its money, that would be bad. At this point, Lakatos says, no, I'm not talking, it's not irrational to continue to work on a research program that's degenerating now, but you do have to keep score honestly. But for me, that was, that Feyerabend had won the essential point there. Because at that point, this research program stuff has ceased to be a guide for action and become entirely a matter of scorekeeping.
I don't know how long you should give a degenerating program before it's...
No, exactly. I mean, when it gets to a couple of centuries, surely,
Yeah.
But I think, that's what went on between Lakatos and Feyerabend. I'd have thought that it should be possible in given cases to say more than that. Whether there's any scope for regeneration, whether there's some bits of the thing that have still got some life in them, or if all you're doing all day is, ad hoc saving catches, then, where is there anything other than a kind of sort of strictly formal hope that it might recover?
Yeah. So this issue of the history business of using successful examples from the history of science to sort of tell us that the successful examples all fit this model. Is it a problem then that the vast majority of Lakatos's examples are physics? I mean, should we be able to generalize to know that perhaps the successful examples in, I don't know, neuroscience are quite different? Maybe is that a legitimate concern or not? Do you think?
I think it is. I mean, it wasn't just him, right? So all philosophy is always a number of decades behind the sciences. So all these guys are looking back to the heroic age of physics in sort of the interwar years when it was really exciting. And there's lots of new stuff to talk about. But yes, I'd have thought so, because they never say this is philosophy of physics. It's always presented as philosophy of science. I'd have thought if you had, I don't know, neuroscience or some other successful bit of science that just didn't fit, well, yeah, that would be a problem.
Okay.
Yeah.
At one point, Lakatos says that the distinction between a hardcore and a heuristic might just be a matter of convention. That's the quote. What do you think that means?
Well, you can put the same thought either in indicative or imperative grammatical moods, right? So if you think that all there really is in the world is corpuscles knocking into each other, you could say that. So let's go, we're back in the 17th century for a moment, right? You could say that, and that will be part of your hardcore, or you your heuristic would be try to explain everything in terms of collisions, right? I mean, it's really the same thought, but it's just in one is a statement, the other one's an instruction.
Yeah.
And if you go through his examples of research programs, it's not hard to make that same move, to pick things out of the hardcore and turn them into instructions for research.
Yeah.
So they become heuristics all the other way.
Okay. So is there no, I mean, some one reading of it, it wouldn't be unreasonable, it seems to me, to interpret some bits of Lakatos at least as sort of implying that the hardcore is more fundamental than the heuristic. But that, what you just said, suggests that it might be a misreading.
I don't think it's a misreading. I think the hardcore idea comes from elsewhere. That's not him. That's already in philosophy of science. We think of it as the Duhem-Quine. Are you all familiar with the Duhem-Quine hypothesis?
No, tell us about that.
So the Duhem-Quine hypothesis is that you can believe anything you like. More precisely, you can hang on to any proposition you like, as long as you're prepared to make sufficiently violent changes to the rest of your belief system. So you want to believe the world's flat? You can, as long as you're prepared to do the considerable work of adjusting everything else you believe in order to accommodate the awkward counter evidence, right? And that's something that philosophy of science students get taught as fairly basic stuff.
So you might, for example, I don't know, believe that when you go around the world, you're actually hallucinating or something like that.
Yeah, or you're actually going around the edge of the disc.
Yeah. Okay.
Something like that. There's a great book about the flat Earth stuff, which Garfield, something like that. Anyway, so that thought that there is a hardcore to your beliefs, which is endlessly predictable, was already there in Quine in the 50s, I guess. And Lakatos inherits that. So if you're starting from that thought, then the idea that the hardcore is a bit harder than anything else, including the heuristic, is kind of built in. But then once he's built his model and starts to look at the cases, then the kind of fuzziness of the heuristic hardcore boundary is just a kind of inescapable feature of the cases that he's assembled.
Yeah.
So it is more of a kind of a retreat from where he started, but I think it's one he has to make.
That's interesting. Okay. Here's a question. Why did Lakatos say that it's only rational to abandon your research program if there's a better one? Like, surely it's possible for me to recognize that my work's going nowhere. I'm doing useless stuff. It's hopeless, and I should just, give up. But maybe I don't have a better alternative. But nevertheless, I can surely recognize that something horrible is happening here.
Oh yeah. So the thing he never sort of resiled from was keeping accurate score, right? So if your research program is degenerating, intellectual honesty requires you to recognize the fact, so that I mean, probably if it really is in trouble, then probably you should be looking for a different discipline area, right? Or a change of career or something.
Job in management.
Or a job in management. Listen, there's a lot of important work to do on the managerial side. But yeah, so I think it's kind of constrained by, given that you're going to stay in science, it's not irrational to plug on, because apart from anything else, you may be assembling data that may be useful
Mm.
for somebody else,
Yeah.
right? So you think about Kazubon, working on the key to all mythologies. Well, he isn't going to succeed, and his research program is dead, but he's doing an awful lot of archival work. Who knows? That might turn out to be somebody comes along with a fresh eye, with a fresh idea. They might be able to use that archive.
Fantastic. One last question then, which is a bit of a sort of a question that really just probably only interests me. So apologies for that, but I'm curious.
I'll let you know.
Okay. I'm curious as to how Lakatos would think about importing disputes from other disciplines into a. So, for example, I'm thinking in particular about how statistics is used in education and psychology. So, there's this big dispute in statistics between the frequentist and Bayesian approaches to probability, and I think that could be accurately be characterized as one of these conflicts between two research programs. They've got really different fundamental views. But quite often these days, you see psychologists and education researchers just cheerfully reporting analyses using both of these quite contradictory approaches in their papers. And I've done that myself. And when I've done that, I've always sort of thought to myself, I wonder if this is a bit incoherent. I'm just ignoring this big important dispute that statisticians have and just making my own progress. What do you think Lakatos would think about that? And what do you think about that?
Well, I mean, one thing is the thought we just had that, it's altogether normal to use data that's been collected under the aegis of some other program. But also, so I happen to have, I thought you might ask this. So here we are in the collected papers. And this is the methodology of scientific research programs, where he's talking about, so we're in section 3, where he's talking about Niels Bohr. And one of the points he makes about Bohr's program, he says, this is in italics, some of the most important research programs in the history of science were grafted onto older programs with which they were blatantly inconsistent. For instance, Copernican astronomy was grafted onto Aristotelian physics, Bohr's programs onto Maxwell's. Elsewhere, he talks about Dirac. So what happens? Well, everybody else thinks that these grafts are irrational because of the inconsistency. I mean, other philosophers of science, right?
Yep.
The ones who are less wise in these matters than Lakatos. But what actually happens? There's a peaceful coexistence until the young program that's been grafted on to something else that it's inconsistent with gets stronger, and then the inconsistencies become important. Then there's a kind of edible thing. The symbiosis becomes competitive, and the champions of the new program try to replace the old program altogether. So, in other words, there are conditions under which it's perfectly normal for inconsistent chunks of scientific thinking to work together. Elsewhere, he talks about the early calculus as having, I mean, that was inconsistent. That wasn't inconsistent with something else. That was just inconsistent, right? And everybody knew it, but they found a way of kind of quarantining the logical problem and using the techniques until such time as it became, they had the tools to sort out the foundations. But you can crash on for a century or two with inconsistent foundations, and you can know it and worry about it, and eventually you sort it out. But it doesn't paralyze things, or it doesn't. I mean, Popperians would think that, oh, if there's an inconsistency in your belief set, that reduces everything to triviality, but clearly it isn't the case. So I think, you know, we've got that.
Yeah.
What you describe isn't quite the same situation, because you haven't got a young program being grafted onto something that it's inconsistent with. You've just got two research traditions, neither of which is able to defeat the other. That are able to, I mean, we know as researchers on mathematics that most people don't care about the foundations. The foundational questions are mostly, you need special historical conditions where the foundational problems become pressing for anybody apart from weirdos to worry about them. So isn't that just what's happening in the case you describe, where there's usable stuff that you can nick and you just don't worry too much about?
I think that's definitely is what's happening. But I guess I worry, and perhaps I think, you know, what you've just said is sort of reassuring, I guess, in a way, that perhaps, well, I guess in a way it's not. Perhaps in 100 years' time, people are going to look back at these papers and go, oh, what were they thinking of? But yeah, I guess, you know, the way you approach statistics is probably related to it is related to your philosophy of science, whether you think you're testing hypotheses or whether you think you're accumulating evidence or whatnot. And so it does seem a bit strange to use these sort of these contradictory approaches and just sort of sweep it under the carpet. But maybe what you're saying is that, yeah, okay, that is a problem. At some point that might cause serious problems, but if it hasn't yet, we shouldn't really worry about it.
Well, you shouldn't stop what you're doing.
Yeah.
Because what you're doing might actually be part of the process of finding a solution to your kind of foundational dilemmas.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's, I mean, how, I mean, I guess the other thing that occurs to me is how heterogeneous is the evidence that you're collecting generally. So, I mean, we know that in education research, one finds everything from, you know, very careful laboratory experimental work through to more experiential, where you elicit the meanings of people's practices by making them make collages and keep diaries and that kind of stuff. It's quite normal in educational research for people to combine really radically heterogeneous forms of evidence. And part of the skill of this kind of social science is precisely to combine very heterogeneous data or evidence in an intellectually honest way, so that you're not just cherry picking things, that, you know, you don't just fall into utter confirmation bias.
Yeah.
So if that's a feature of educational research generally, that we're already used to combining some stats with some student voice.
Yeah, I guess that is a feature of the discipline. I think it's perhaps less common, well, certainly not in my work anyway, to do that in the same kind of in the same project. So it's really a case of you've got the same data and you're just analysing it in two different ways. Now, in almost every situation, those two different ways give you the same answer in some, you know, substantive sense, but they are seeming to make quite different sort of statistical and philosophical assumptions, which
Okay, but that you may have put your finger on it, actually, because there is this robustness test, isn't there? That any research you do, any sort of academic argument you make will be within some kind of methodological or ideological frame. Then you can test for robustness to see if versions of the same point pop up.
Yeah.
In different frames. So I mean, you get this in philosophy, right? So if the same thought pops up in a Heideggerian frame and a kind of, strictly analytic frame with a bit of translation care, you think, oh, actually, maybe this is a deep point. Maybe it isn't just an artifact of these particular intellectual traditions. So maybe the answer to your question has got nothing to do with Lakatos. Maybe it's just that robustness test, that if you get the same point turning out, however you slice it,
Yeah.
then maybe it really is a deep point.
So the danger, of course, then is, if you do 100 of these experiments and you do the same analysis, when you do the analysis in both ways, and then on the 100th time they give different results, then suddenly you're, oh, what do I do now? And then so I guess the point is that that's when, if that happens, that's when these conflicts come to the fore, and we've got to start thinking about it a bit more carefully, and that's when progress is made.
Right. So now you've got a picture of how it's possible for these inconsistencies to be unproblematic for quite a long time and then suddenly come to a boil.
Yeah. Well, that's fantastic. Thank you very much for giving up your time to talk to us. I've taken up much more of your time than I said I would, but I enjoyed talking to you very much. So I hope you don't object to me wasting your time for too long. I will stop recording now and just say thank you once more, Brendan. Really appreciate it.
Oh, you're very welcome.